Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. The topic of this webinar is California's 50% Renewable Portfolio Standard. This webinar is a presentation of the Rps Collaborative, which is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And our host for this webinar is CESA's Executive Director, Warren Leon. We have a couple of excellent guest speakers with us today, and before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options for joining the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using a telephone or you can connect using a computer mic and speakers. Both of these options are fine, and there are some directions on your screen. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will read through your questions as they come in, and we will get to as many as time allows during our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please do type those in as you think of them. Don't wait until the end to submit your questions. We do have a lot of people that we are expecting to attend, so we should have a lot of questions, and we want to make sure that we get to yours, so type it in when you think of it. A final note, this webinar is being recorded, and you will find a recording of this webinar on our website at cesa.org/webinars. We also have all of our previous webinars archived there. And we will also be sending you a recording of this webinar via email within about 24 hours. So with that, I'd like to pass this over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. This webinar is being hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national organization of public agencies that promote and seek to advance clean energy. And you could see logos of our members on this slide. And one of the activities we do as an organization is to manage the Rps Collaborative. If Sam, you could go to the next slide. The Rps Collaborative is funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and this is a vehicle for allowing people who are interested in renewable portfolio standards to share ideas, best practices, challenges, learn from each other. And we run monthly newsletters, we do webinars, we do reports. If you want to get on the website, get on the mailing list, go to our website and you could sign up for the mailing list. And one of our big events is each year we hold an annual RPS Summit in Washington, D.C. That's going to be taking place next week, and today's the last day to register. You can go to our website and find out about it. Registration is free for government employees, and it's modestly priced for anyone else. If you could go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be focusing on the California RPS. In recent months, a number of different states have taken steps to expand and extend and strengthen their RPSs, and through the Rps Collaborative, we're going to do webinars on some of these states that have done that. And one state that is, of course, of special interest is the state of California, because it's our largest state, and it's a state that has had an ambitious RPS program up till now, and they're making it even more ambitious, and we're going to hear about it today. The RPS in California is administered as an activity with both responsibilities that are undertaken by the California Public Utilities Commission and by the California Energy Commission. So we have two presentations today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, Cheryl Lee, and then after she gives her talk, I'll introduce our second speaker, Emily Chisholm, and then we'll have questions. And as Samantha suggested, type in your questions at any time. So Cheryl is a senior regulatory analyst in the California Public Utilities Commission Energy Division, and in that capacity, she's responsible for RPS procurement planning oversight, review of proposed RPS power purchase agreements, and implementation of RPS legislation and policy. To give you a sense of how the RPS in California has changed and grown over time, in the time that she's been at the California Public Utilities Commission, the RPS program there has grown from less than 500 megawatts of installed RPS capacity to over 10,000 megawatts. And the RPS requirements have increased from 20% in 2010 to 50% in 2030. So we're now going to hear from Cheryl and what she and her colleagues at the Public Utilities Commission are doing to plan for this expanded and enhanced RPS. So Cheryl, you're on.
Great. Thank you, Samantha and Warren. So as Warren mentioned, we're talking mostly about the changes to California's RPS and our implementation of the new 50% requirement. So I would like to just give you a brief overview of what I plan to talk about, which is some of the background, which Warren's gone over some, and our current RPS program status, as well as how we are going to get to the 50%. So the RPS program is a market-based program, and it requires all California load-serving entities to procure increasing amounts of renewable energy. So load-serving entities in our context is utilities, both private and public, as well as other entities that have customers such as direct access. The RPS program, as mentioned, was first in statute in 2002, but it only applied to retail sellers. But it now applies to all retail sellers, and the current goal is 50% by 2030. When the program originally started, it had several goals, one being displacing fossil fuel use in California, but also just increasing the actual capacity, so the number of renewable power plants in the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, as well as increased flexibility with the grid and promoting stable rates. And the RPS program itself is measured in terms of renewable energy credits, which are known as RECs, and where one REC is equal to 1 megawatt hour of RPS eligible electricity. So as mentioned, the program requirements have actually changed several times since the program began, with the goal actually only being 20% by 2017 in the very beginning. It was accelerated in 2006, and then more recently, both in 2011, it was up to 33%, and then in 2015, Senate Bill 350 established the 50% by 2030. So the RPS program, not until recently, has really been integrated into California's climate change goals. So we first had the California Global Warming Solutions Act in 2006, also known as AB 32. But then SB 350 not only increased the RPS requirement to 50%, but it also incorporated the RPS into our GHG reduction goals, to where we're also aiming for a 50% increase in energy savings in existing buildings, as well as establishing integrated resource plans where they're going to identify a portfolio of resources to reach our actual GHG goals, which more recently were established this year and to be 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So the integrated resource plans are aiming to look at not only renewables and energy efficiency, but also demand response, and seeing how our existing fleet of also natural gas facilities can come together as a portfolio to meet those GHG emission reductions. So as Maureen mentioned, the RPS program in California is actually jointly overseen by a number of agencies. So not only the PUC, but also the California Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board. Emily will talk more about her role in the CECs as well as the Air Resources Board. At the PUC, we're responsible for overseeing the investor-owned utilities, the community choice aggregators, and electric service providers. And part of their requirements for the program are to have RPS procurement plans. We also approve and reject investor-owned utility contracts that are executed to meet their RPS requirements. We also work on the long-term resource planning for renewables and integrated resource planning, determine RPS procurement and compliance requirements for those entities that we oversee. And then we also determine whether or not penalties are required for any non-compliance by those entities. And then just to make sure everyone understands the background of our program and how we actually calculate the requirement and compliance. As I mentioned, there are renewable energy credits, or RECs, and each one is equal to 1 megawatt of renewable energy. And the RPS requirement is calculated based on a percentage of retail sales. So the actual amount that needs to be procured to meet the requirement is in the numerator of that equation. And each entity is aiming to procure that amount of renewable energy. We have seen with the growing requirements, growing amount of actual renewable energy in California. So in the beginning, the large investor-owned utilities, which make up about 75% of California's load-serving entities, it started at about 13% in 2004, and in 2015 we were up to almost 28%. The 3 large IOUs are expected to meet RPS requirements through 2020, which is 33%, and they're well positioned to meet actually the later requirements of the program as well. So to give you a sense of the portfolios for those large IOUs and to see how the program has changed the state's portfolio in terms of resource technology and the diversity. Started out with a large portion actually being geothermal and biopower. As the program has seen more facilities come on, we've seen more of number of wind facilities and solar photovoltaic facilities actually becoming part of the portfolio. And those portions are looking to be increasing, and that is based on the contracts that they have signed up, and those contracts are typically have been for new facilities. So we're seeing new facilities actually built primarily in wind and solar PV. So in getting to implementing a 50% RPS program, with the statute changes over the years, it hasn't been limited to just changing the number amount. It changes actually a number of rules, and the RPS program is actually fairly complicated in terms of the number of rules and the various statutes. So in this latest round of changes, I've listed 7 particular changes. I won't go into detail on all of them. Emily will have some of those details later in her presentation. But I did want to give you a sense of our implementation, I guess, challenges in terms of it does, when you have the legislation change every few years, you do always seem to have a number of changes which do take time to implement. So number 1 is just mostly describing the change from the 33% to 50%. But then we have a number of different changes going through, including changes to penalties and potential waivers for noncompliance at the very bottom there. the implementation of these statute and rule changes will be a public process. We will include several different times solicitation for comments, and then once we have a record, we do issue proposed decisions, which have opportunities for the public and different parties to comment on the proposals. We began this implementation process earlier this year, and that will continue into next year. So far, we have issued a proposed decision, just about a little over, or I guess just less than a week ago, and that implements the first bulleted first number on the previous slide, which is the procurement quantity requirements and compliance periods. And so we expect, if as it goes as planned, we will have that on our December 15th commission meeting to have it be voted on by our commissioners. Next, after that, we do plan to continue to address the various changes, as well as coordinate with our integrated resource plan process, which is still getting up and running and moving along quickly. So while the Public Utilities Commission is responsible for implementing the statute and the rule changes, it is really the retail sellers of electricity that are responsible for procuring the resources to meet their RPS requirements. The PUC does have varying oversight over the different entities, but we do get regular reporting from the retail sellers, and that helps the PUC understand the different barriers and successes of the program. And so that allows us to look at potential issues that might prevent retail sellers from meeting requirements. So again, while they're responsible for doing the procuring, they may come into different challenges, such as coming across project failure or contract failure, which could be a difficulty in them meeting the requirements. So the PUC may address some of these issues as we oversee the procurement process. And we also work with other agencies to try and identify the best resource areas and transmission needs for the state, to where a lot of our development of new solar photovoltaic facilities has been in areas that haven't seen development before and may be transmission constrained, and so work with different agencies to address those issues. The PUC, as I mentioned, does oversee the compliance determination for all of the retail sellers, so that again includes the investor-owned utilities, community choice aggregators, and electric service providers or direct access providers. And if the entities are not able to meet the requirements, they could be penalized. There are waivers set in the statute if an entity is in noncompliance, and so as I mentioned before, if they're having they had transmission constraint issues potentially, if there was something that was out of their control, could potentially ask for a waiver and could be granted. But we have actually yet to see any instances of noncompliance yet. So far, we have seen good success with the program, and hope as we implement the 50% program and go forward with that, that we will see the same type of success. So more.
Hello. Hey, thanks very much, Cheryl. That gave us a good overview. Before we switch to Emily and her presentation, let me just ask one question that came up. The situation in California is somewhat unusual in terms of RPS management and administration being divided among several state agencies. Cheryl, could you let folks know why it was done that way, if you know the answer to that?
Sure. I mean, in some parts it's related to the agency responsibilities. So the PUC is responsible for overseeing that there's safe, reliable electrical service at reasonable rates. And so as the RPS program, it is dealing with, when it started, newer technologies that will have a cost impact. In California, the electricity procurement does go to the ratepayer. So we are set with overseeing that and have those responsibilities. So it goes to a lot of just the agencies and their responsibilities for why the program is divided.
Okay, good. Well, there'll be opportunity for more questions, and I'm going to introduce Emily. And while we're doing that, Sam, you may want to notice I sent you a chat note for you to respond to. Thank you. And so Emily Chisholm is the Verification and Compliance Lead for California's RPS program at the California Energy Commission. She works on the Energy Commission's regulations for the RPS, works on verification of the RPS eligibility of claims submitted by all California utilities, and the determination of compliance for publicly owned utilities. Emily has worked at the Energy Commission for 7 years, including the last 5 in the Renewable Energy Division. So with that, let's turn it over to Emily so we could see another piece of the RPS administration. Okay, there you go, Emily.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Emily Chisholm, and I work in the Renewable Energy Division of the California Energy Commission. I will be covering the RPS implementation responsibilities of the California Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board, the new requirements and provisions of the 50% RPS as enacted by SB 350, and the Energy Commission's process for implementing the 50% RPS. The Energy Commission is responsible for certifying renewable generating facilities as RPS eligible. We verify the RPS eligibility of energy procured by load-serving entities, and we assess whether POUs are in compliance with the RPS. The Air Resources Board's role in the RPS is limited to assessing penalties when the Energy Commission issues a notice of violation for a POU. California's RPS eligible resources are shown here, and they are defined in statute. The RPS program does not have technology preferences. The Energy Commission's RPS eligibility guidebook specifies the criteria and process for certifying generating facilities as eligible renewable energy resources for the RPS. And the RPS eligibility guidebook also includes reporting and verification requirements for all program participants. All RECs are retired by load-serving entities for California's RPS and are reported to the Energy Commission so that we can verify that they were generated by the RPS eligible facilities. We compare the claims made from a facility against the facility's generation when possible to ensure that there was sufficient generation to cover the claims. For multi-fuel facilities, we calculate how much of the generation qualifies as renewable. And we verify that procurement exclusively serves California's RPS and is not double counted toward another renewable energy regulatory or market program. All RECs for California's RPS are required to be tracked in the Western Renewable Energy Generation Information System, or REGIS. REGIS is an independent renewable energy tracking system for the region covered by the covered by the WEC, and it helps us to ensure that renewable generation is tracked accurately and is not double counted. The Energy Commission is also responsible for determining POU compliance with the RPS program. The Energy Commission establishes the rules and procedures by which a POU's procurement actions are assessed. And there are currently 44 POUs in the state of California, and they come in a wide range of sizes, very small to the third biggest utility in California. They're all POUs. After we finish verifying the eligibility of RECs, as discussed in the last slide, we then determine the portfolio content category of the RECs. So as background, California's RPS has 3 portfolio content categories, which we also call buckets. I kind of use the terms interchangeably. Category 1 is made up of RECs that are procured bundled from a facility that is either interconnected to a California Balancing Authority or scheduled directly into a California Balancing Authority. Category 2 is firmed and shaped generation from outside of a California Balancing Authority. And Category 3 is any REC that doesn't meet the criteria of Category 1 or 2, and that's mostly made up of unbundled RECs. So we calculate the POU's procurement requirements each compliance period and determine whether there are any deficits in meeting those requirements. There are optional compliance measures available set by statute and regulations that may excuse deficits in certain cases, but if a POU does not meet its requirements and does not have any applicable optional compliance measures, then we may issue a notice of violation against the POU, at which point they go to the Air Resources Board for a penalty determination. The current RPS compliance periods cover 2011 through 2020 with a 20% goal, 25% goal, and then a 33% goal. SB 350 sets new post-2020 procurement targets for all load-serving entities to procure 40% renewables by the end of 2024, 45% by the end of 2027, and 50% by the end of 2030. Currently, utilities can bank excess RECs from one compliance period for subsequent compliance periods from any bucket except for bucket 3, but they must subtract any RECs from short-term contracts. And we define a short-term contract as a contract that is less than 10 years. SB 350 revised the rules for excess procurement so that starting in 2021, utilities will no longer have to subtract RECs from short-term contracts. However, in the new rules, both Bucket 2 and Bucket 3 RECs won't qualify for banking. They'll actually have to just be applied to that compliance period. They can't carry them forward. As a balance to the new excess procurement rules, SB 350 introduced a new requirement for all utilities to procure renewables through long-term contracts, so that beginning in 2021, at least 65% of renewable procurement in each compliance period must be from contracts of 10 years or longer. If a utility is able to meet the 65% long-term requirement in the 2017 through 2020 compliance period, which is the compliance period before it's first required in 2021, then the utility can opt into the new excess procurement rules in the 2017 through 2020 compliance period and not have to subtract their short-term RECs out. The RPS has a short list of optional compliance measures which can excuse a shortfall in meeting the RPS. One of the options is cost limitations, which limits what a utility will pay for renewable generation in order to avoid excessive rate impacts from the RPS. SB 350 revises the statutory requirements so that expenditures used to determine the cost limitation are no longer required to rely on a utility's most recent procurement plan, and it is no longer necessary to exclude indirect expenses, which are things like imbalance energy charges and the cost of transmission upgrades. Another optional compliance measure is delay of timely compliance, which has a set list of existing conditions to excuse noncompliance, such as not enough transmission capacity and unanticipated curtailment of renewable resources. SB 350 revises the conditions for delay of timely compliance by adding unanticipated increases in retail sales due to transportation electrification to the existing list. SB 350 also introduced a few new provisions that are specific to POUs. Starting in 2014, a POU can exclude retail sales served by a voluntary green pricing program or a shared renewables program from its calculation of retail sales. A similar option is already available for retail sellers. And in this new exclusion, the POU's green pricing procurement must have qualified for Category 1 and be located close to load. There are 2 POUs that already have special procurement requirements due to their owned large hydroelectric facilities, San Francisco PUC and Merced Irrigation District. SB 350 adds a third hydro exemption that may apply to several POUs, mostly in Northern California. The exemption applies to POUs that procure more than 50% of their retail sales from qualifying large hydro generation in any given year. So that in years of high hydro, this exemption may result in a reduction in the amount of renewables a qualifying POU is required to procure. All right, on to implementing the new rules in SB 350. The Energy Commission's implementation of the 50% RPS program will be conducted through a formal rulemaking process. In August of this year, we released a pre-rulemaking draft and held a workshop to discuss the proposed language. We received stakeholder comments on the draft, and we are currently working on updating our draft amendments to the regulations and putting together our initial rulemaking package. The formal rulemaking package will implement the 50% RPS, including any changes made in statute, which includes the SB 350 rules, and of course, there's also a new cleanup bill that just passed, this year, so we're going to have to put those rules in at the same time. And we may make other improvements and clarifications that we've found necessary to the RPS program. And that's it from my presentation. If you'd like more information on the Energy Commission's RPS program, here's a link to our RPS main page, and here's my email address if you'd like to contact me. And I'll hand it back over to Lauren.
Yep. Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you both for very good presentations. I have a number of questions that have come in, but people can send in more if they so desire. But let me go through some of the questions. This is for either of you. And somebody was asking, can utilities get their RECs from out of state, or do they all have to be from in-state?
RECs have to be generated by a facility that is located inside the WEC. They don't have to be within California.
Okay. That's good to know. And is there any entity that's exempt from the RPS?
There is one POU that is exempt from the RPS. It's Trinity, and they receive, I believe, 100% of their retail sales from federally owned large hydro, and so as long as they continue to exist, they do not have to report to us. That's the only exemption on my side. Cheryl, do you have any exemptions?
No, we don't.
Okay, good. And how about community choice aggregators? Does that introduce any complications or challenges into the RPS?
There could be some. They do have to meet the same requirements. The challenge may be they tend to have a smaller amount of load versus typically when a facility is built, it has just one off-taker. So some facilities are quite large, and so their amount of generation may be more than a CCA could potentially use. So there may need to be some change in terms of how procurement has traditionally been done. Their customer territory does overlap with the investor-owned utilities, so where the program for the RPS has been going on for a long time, and the contracts have typically been long-term commitments due to the nature of the facilities being new, and because they're costly investments, they usually have a long-term financing, and to go along with long-term financing, they typically like to have long-term contracting to off-take the generation. So we are seeing, what was expected in terms of number of customers or load changing, which may cause, future difficulties in terms of, what the market may look like in terms of just the procurement trends may change.
Okay. I have a number of specific, slightly technical questions of the type I've been asking up till now. But before I get back to some of those, let me ask a couple of broader questions. Compared to some RPSs which go up gradually on a yearly basis, so it'll go up from 20% in 2020 to 21% in 2021 and so on. Your RPS is structured into these 5-year blocks where there are sharp rises every few years. Does that create any problems or issues either for you folks in the government entities that are administering the RPS, or does that create problems for the utilities and other entities that have to comply with it?
So the program actually started out with annual requirements, and it was changed to what we have compliance periods. They're 3 or 4 years, and the idea with that was that procurement could be kind of what we call lumpy in terms of if a new facility, as I was mentioning, that's typically been new facilities been coming online to meet the program. They don't all come on at the same time. There may be different incentives for them to come online at different times. And so by having a compliance period, you're measuring compliance over the 3 or 4 years, to where if you do have a down year in one of those years, you can make up for it in the other years of the compliance period to actually meet the requirements, because the requirements are measured over the total number of amount of recs for that compliance period. So it's not specific to 1 year, to where you can instead you meet it over several years.
Okay. And does that create any concern that an entity that's subject to compliance could fall so far behind that it wouldn't become obvious until the end of the compliance period, at which point it'd be too late for them to do anything about it?
That is a potential concern in terms of kind of waiting towards the last minute, you might say. We do over monitor essentially. On our end, we require annual compliance reports, so we're able to see their progress over time. As I mentioned, we also require procurement plans, and so that is our way of seeing if they are anticipating their procurement needs and see what barriers they have to try and identify that before it becomes too big of a problem.
And at least at the Energy Commission, we also require forecasting for the rest of the compliance period.
Okay, that seems like a good idea. You've both given the impression that the RPS is moving forward smoothly. There's a lot of additional procurement and project development underway. There was recently a study that came out, I believe, last week that argued that the duck curve was happening in California faster than expected with larger than expected ramp-ups. The person who wrote this question wanted to ask, is that something that is perceived to be a potential issue for RPS compliance, or are you quite confident that you will be able to adjust things so that daily and seasonal changes in intermittent renewable generation can be incorporated into the system?
So yeah, I have heard of the duck curve potentially being more extreme sooner than what was originally expected. I think it is some concern, but I think it's part of, one of the, there is a waiver condition related to unexpected, larger than expected curtailment. So that would be with the duck curve if there is so much, say, solar PV generation coming on where it actually needs to be told to be turned off and not generated, which would then mean that the entity couldn't actually claim any of RECs because nothing was generated. But we are seeing several different paths potentially integrating all the renewables. So California does also have a storage mandate into working in that way, and we see a lot of the issue more of when the solar generation begins to come offline due to the sun going down, and dealing with that is when we see actually more of a peak in California to where you have businesses still running and then people also coming home, and so that the load is increasing then. So that is where we're seeing more of the issues, but definitely there is, we do have a market to try and incentivize when generation occurs in California, and so we're definitely addressing it in several different ways.
Good. Well, let me turn to some more narrowly framed questions. One is, are the portfolio category requirements the same percentage-wise for the 2030 to 2050 timeframe?
Yes, they stay the same as they are at the end of the 33% program. They'll stay the same after that through 2030 and theoretically beyond that as well. While the percentage of renewables has to increase, the share of portfolio content category 1 will stay the same at 75%.
Okay, good. And can IOUs include generation that is outside the plan approved in their integrated resource plan?
I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but in terms of in statute, the integrated resource plan is to include a 50% RPS. It's still in the early stages, but I know that there's been discussions or scenarios to where to meet the GHG reduction goals, there may be needed to be 55 or 60% actually RPS for those GHG reductions to occur. So in that way, I guess you would say that that extra 10% to be part of the IRP that could count towards the RPS requirement.
Okay. I think this person may, I'm not sure, but I think they may also be wanting to get at is if utility files a plan that says we're going to be developing these sorts of projects, but then they end up being able to purchase generation from a different project. Can they count that?
So for our RPS procurement plans, it is an annual process. It does try and look out 20 years into the future, but it does focus on the procurement that will happen over the next year. So if these changes were made over time, it couldn't count. It does get specific to what can be approved on a year-to-year basis, though.
Okay. And here's a question for you, Emily. This is about the requirement of 65% of renewables coming from contracts of 10 or more years. How does that impact PURPA facilities, if at all?
I don't believe there would be any special rules for those PURPA. I know a lot of their contracts are ending, and as they renegotiate their contracts, then obviously it would be preferred for them to enter into new long-term contracts. But if after their long-term contracts end and they don't enter into new long-term contracts, at that point, any RECs that they sell would be classified as short-term contracts. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, that sounds good. And does California in the RPS have any carve-out for requiring thermal renewable energy credits, or has there been any proposals made to have that sort of carve-out that some other states have established in recent years?
We do not have technology-specific carve-outs for the RPS requirement in general. There have been more recently kind of varying mandates to procure a certain technology, but that has been more outside of the RPS program itself. The RPS, if an entity wanted it, could meet it entirely, through geothermal or solar photovoltaic. There's no mandate on having a diversity or a specific technology.
Well, this is along the same line about technology, and this is from someone who obviously has an opinion, but will want your reaction, and that is saying, hey, the different technologies have different benefits and different environmental costs, and recently there have been concerns raised about biomass in particular and its ultimate CO2 emissions. Has there been any discussion in California about narrowing the range of technologies that are included in order to push out something like biomass that has been allowed up till now?
Yes, we agree that the different technologies have different generation profiles and potentially different costs and benefits. We do require, in terms of at least the investor-owned utilities, to take a least cost benefit approach to where the criteria does look at is there more value if one resource generates more at a certain time of day than the others. It does also include criteria for disadvantaged community impact and such, so that is considered in terms of the actual siting of the facility. That is done by our different agencies or the counties or local jurisdictions, and those all need to go through California Environmental Quality Act review. So we do take those things into consideration, but as far as I know, there hasn't been any specific discussions related to narrowing down what technologies count.
Okay. And you both talked about what happened, conditions in which a entity is not able to meet their RPS requirements. Are there sort of broader issues having to do with overall compliance, any cost tests or economic safety valves that would extend the time frame if the costs of technologies don't come down as hoped, or if the overall state economy is depressed? Or is it the case there's such a strong consensus that you folks have this under control and you're going to be able to do it?
So the RPS program has, since the beginning, had a what's been referred to as a cost containment or renewables, but not at any cost approach into it, and we still do have that. It's sometimes also referred to as a procurement expenditure limit. It has been revised several times, so it is an item that we do need to implement for the 50% program. I think that the most recent language is that we don't want to have a disproportionate rate impact as a result of the RPS program. We are still working on how we can implement that and determine what that exactly will result in terms of what the limit is.
Okay, good. Well, what I am going to do is ask a couple more questions that have come in and then give each of you a couple minutes to say anything else you may want to say that you haven't had a chance to say. And I'll go with a question for you, Emily. And somebody asked if you could say a little bit more about the green pricing exclusions.
Sure. So for POUs that have green pricing programs or a shared renewables program, find this is that those retail sales, those customers who are kind of opting into a higher renewable electricity are already being served by renewables, and therefore they don't need an additional 50% RPS built on top of that. So if we can verify that those retail sales are being served by renewables that meet the same standards as the RPS, then we can just exclude those retail sales kind of off the top. And the utility will only then have to procure the RPS percentage for whatever remains. I know there's a program for the retail sellers, and I don't know if Cheryl wants to add anything. I think it's built similarly. I don't know if it's exactly the same.
Cheryl, do you want to add anything on that, or should I go on to the next question?
You can just go on to the next one.
Okay. This, from some of the folks on the call who are from out of state, a lot of states are always interested in trying to maximize RPS development within state in order to capture the economic development benefits of that development. Have there been any reports or studies in California that talk about the benefits of sourcing RECs from out of state? Or any recognition of why you might want to get RECs from out of state beyond, complying with the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which is always a useful thing to do?
Well, we certainly allow RECs from outside of state. In order to count it the same as in-state, as Category 1, the verification is a little bit more tough. You have to show e-tags to show that it was delivered into a California balancing authority, and you have to actually show an hourly analysis of the meter data versus the schedule. So there's a little bit more work for it, but otherwise they're equal to us. I don't know if there's been any kind of analysis. Cheryl, do you know?
I can't think of anything specific. In California, though, we are currently examining, I guess, expanding our ISO into, the larger WEC region, to where I know it has been expressed, but I don't know if it's actually been studied in terms of what the RPS compliance costs may be in terms of potentially reduced. It's been argued that to develop something in California is more expensive than maybe elsewhere, so if it were easier to procure renewable resources outside of California, it potentially could reduce some costs.
Okay, interesting. Good. And so do either of you have anything else you want to say to the group that wasn't covered by any of the questions up to now?
I don't think I have anything.
Well, hearing...
Neither here.
Well, look, I want to thank both of you. You've covered your topics well, and, as you can tell from the large number of questions we had here, there are people around the country who are always very interested in learning about what's going on in California, and we'll keep monitoring what's happening there as your RPSs move forward. So thanks very much for talking to us today, and we'll be back with more webinars in the future. Bye now.